Now we're going to take a look at three of the nutrients I listed before. And these are all called macronutrients, which are fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, because they're the main source of energy for all the activities that we do. And they also provide a lot of the raw materials for various things in the body that's needed, enzymes and all the other molecules that the cell needs to function require these three components as the raw material. Now we're going to start with fats first. So both fats and oils have the same molecular building block. This is called triglycerides. So fats are just triglycerides that are solids at room temperature, whereas oils are triglycerides that are liquids at room temperature. The molecular structure is shown here. It looks pretty complex, right? So it has this carbon, hydrogen, and then what we call the COO group right here. This is called a carboxyl group in chemistry. And the reason that exists is because these triglycerides are a combination of two other molecular precursors. One of them is a fatty acid. So a fatty acid looks like this. It has this COOH group right here. The H there is the acid. So you remember when we discuss acids, they all have H and they release proton when they're dissolved in water. So this is a group of compounds called carboxylic acids, but in this specific case, because it has a long carbon chain next to them, we call it a fatty acid. And then on the other side here, we have something called glycerol, which is a type of molecule in chemistry that we call an alcohol. It has a bunch of these OH groups, and when they react together, the OH from the fatty acid and the H from the glycerol combine to form water, and then the black lettering combine together to form the triglycerides. Now, the type of fatty acids that combine with the glycerol determines what kind of triglycerides you're going to make. It all comes about from these R groups right here. So you see R1, R2, R3. Those are just carbon chains. So this is the COO group right here. So this is often called a polar head of the fatty acid because this group is very polar, right? It has this dipole between the CO. But then the rest of these are CH. So they look like the zigzag lines, but each dot there represents a carbon atom that has a number of hydrogen showing up on it. So basically just a long carbon chain. So this is the space filling model. You can see that this is just a long carbon chain. So if the R groups here are just composed of carbon-carbon single chain, so it just looks like this and it extends like this, you can see that it forms this fairly linear structure, right? And so when that happens, we call it a saturated fatty acid. The reason it's called saturated is because all the bonds are saturated by hydrogens already. So there's no way to add more hydrogen to that structure because all the carbons already have 4 bonds around it. There's no double bond. The unsaturated fatty acids contains some double bonds. It could be 1, could be more. So here's an example that has exactly 1. And the double bond introduces a kink in the structure because the double bond is rigid. It bends the structure a certain way, so then the rest of it goes this way. So in the space filling model, you can see it clearly here that this is the single bond carbon-carbon. Here's the double bond, introduces that kink, and then the rest of the molecule bends this way. This is called unsaturated. The unsaturated refers to the fact that that double bond could be broken, converted into single bond by adding hydrogen to it. Now, the reason why these two things matter in nutrition beyond chemistry is because the saturated fatty acids, as it turns out, even though it's made up only by these nonpolar groups, which is these carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds, they can form the nonpolar interactions, which you recall we discussed before. They're called London forces or dispersion forces. Those forces are weak, but when you have a lot of them between one molecule and the other one, you could get a fairly strong force as a result of it. Strong enough that these molecules, when there's a lot of them together packed like this, with these yellow or golden part of it showing the carbon-carbon part, and then that's the polar head. When there's enough of them, they packed up pretty well that they actually don't melt until you reach a higher temperature, so they have higher melting points. Which, another way to say that is that the saturated fats are solids at room temperature. However, the unsaturated fat, because of this branching, they can't pack as closely together, right? So some parts of it can pack closely, but the other parts are separated pretty far away because it's not as closely packed. They don't form a solid, but they form a liquid. Now, this matters to health because if you have a solid fat stuck in your arteries, that could possibly lead to a heart disease because your blood pressure goes up and the blood can't go through to where it needs to go. Lack of oxygen leads to malfunction in your cell. Okay, let's go to the second of our macronutrients, which is carbohydrates. So carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and the ratio of the hydrogen and oxygen atoms actually is 2:1, the same as you see in water. So that's how the original name came about. It just means carbon plus water. Hydrates is just water. The simplest one are what we call monosaccharides, which are simple sugars. And these are what they look like. So you see that they actually are not linear chains like our fats earlier, but they're ring compounds. All the atoms going to form this ring structure, okay? Some of them are pentagons like this, and some of them are hexagons. So you can combine any two of these monosaccharides into a disaccharide, which just means two saccharides combined together. So here's a monosaccharide. Here's a disaccharide that's composed of a monosaccharide that has a hexagonal structure and another one that has a pentagonal structure. And then those can combine further to form what we call polysaccharides, which might look like this. Going back to our discussion of polymers, this would be one of your natural occurring polymers, okay? The simple sugars, the monosaccharides, there's 3 different types that you need to know: glucose, fructose, and galactose. Interestingly, they all have the same chemical formula, but when you look at the structural formula, the way the atoms are arranged, they obviously look quite different from each other. And as a result, they have different properties. Here's a breakdown of the different mono, di, and polysaccharides. The monosaccharide mainly is just used as source of energy. So when you eat carbohydrates, eventually in the body, it gets broken down into monosaccharide, particularly for humans, is glucose. The glucose then undergoes a number of steps to break it down, eventually releasing it as carbon dioxide. Remember, the chemical bonds store energy. So when you break down these chemical bonds, you release that energy. That's what for humans is used to provide energy for all our activities. Once you build this up to larger molecules like disaccharides or polysaccharides, you can't just take this and use it for an energy source. It's just too big. You have to break it down to simple sugar before you can then break it down further. The polysaccharide is just a way to store all of this energy. These are some of the names of the disaccharides and polysaccharides. You might recognize some of these, like sucrose, for example. That's your table sugar, by the way. That's the one that you have at home. Lactose, the one that you have in milk sugar. The larger form, the polysaccharides, you can see that starch, cellulose is the one we use for paper making. Glycogen is a type of sugar we found in animal cells. Now, one of the most common sugars that you might have heard of in industry is high fructose corn syrup, or HFCS. This is a type of sugar that is used to sweeten many beverages and food. It has different names in different countries, but the claim from the food manufacturers is that the high fructose corn syrup sugars gives you better flavor and, more importantly, some stability in the sugar. So if you keep the food for longer, it will still taste the same as when it's new, and just the consistency in the food so it doesn't degrade that quickly. A lot of claims have been made, mostly bad, about this high fructose corn syrup in the popular media. So the American Medical Association had done some research into it and figured out that it's not likely that high fructose corn syrup contributes more to obesity than other conditions compared to just your simple table sugar, the sucrose. Basically, eat too much sugar, some problems are going to start to happen. So it doesn't really matter which form of sugars you take. It doesn't mean you don't want to eat sugar. Obviously, it's a source of energy for your cells, but you need to make sure you eat it in a reasonable amount. A lot of companies actually have switched high fructose corn syrup to just sucrose, but it looks like it has the same issue as high fructose corn syrup.